Starting us off at number 10 is Cursed Like a Sailor. One nurse who works in the ICU took to Reddit under the name CABC, posting the weirdest thing a patient ever said to them. They start off by saying, quote, "I had a gentleman who was DNR on comfort care. He was demented and was cursing like a sailor. He seemed to have moments of clarity and when asked to see his brothers, who were both dead." Now, that all by itself, not creepy whatsoever. I mean, nurses are definitely used to an array of colorful language, considering how much of their days are spent with people in immense pain. But after a particularly worrisome heart rhythm, his rate started speeding up exponentially, and she began to think that this might be the end. At that moment, Reddit user says, quote, "The patient looked at me in the eyes and said, 'What's your name?' To which I replied, 'My name.' He asked, 'What do you do here?' 'I'm a nurse,' I replied. The dying man was quiet for some time, then out of nowhere he just said, 'F you,' and died in silence 20 minutes later. I mean, what was the reason? Coming in at number 9 is Paint the House. Maybe it's just me, but I think the biggest question people have about dying is, will they get to see those who have already died wherever it is they are going? It's the whole what really happens to us when we die that likely plagues most of us. So maybe this isn't the darkest on the list, but it's still a bit odd nonetheless. In a post made by a now deleted Reddit account, the nurse explained one of the strangest and simultaneously comforting things they've ever heard. The post said they overheard a conversation between a patient and their grandchild. The grandfather was fading fast, but he turned to his granddaughter and said, quote, Dar, I can't hang around. Your grandma needs me to paint the house." The granddaughter was just about to remind him that her grandma had been dead for several years and there was no house to paint. Then he died right there and then in front of her. The Reddit user claims that while a bit strange, she likes to think that he really was living in his afterlife with his wife painting their house. Next up at number 8, he knew. This one comes from Reddit user Paper Rainbow, and they start off by saying that they came into work for an early shift and were handed over to a patient who had been experiencing high levels of anxiety, including a panic attack the previous evening. Reddit friend continues on saying that all morning the patient had still been quite anxious, but was showing nothing that was concerning and that tests were still coming back fine. So they were merely there to sit with him and make sure he felt okay. But then things started getting weird. The patient starts getting worse, breathing, lying in fetal, and looking like they're on the brink of another panic attack. So the Reddit user tries to reassure them, saying doctors will be here in 10 minutes and to please lie on his back so that he can better monitor his breathing. He refuses, saying, quote, "I won't make it until they get here and I won't face the other way." Still, the patient continued to be really agitated, so this time the nurse suggested to move for comfort. That's when he said, quote, "I won't make it until the doctors get here. If I turn to face the other way, I'll be gone." The patient repeated this phrase over and over and over. Then sure enough, as soon as the doctors walked in, he turned to the other side and died. I mean, that can't have just been a coincidence. Coming in at number 7, I understand. In a now deleted Reddit account, one nurse posted saying that although they had heard many strange or concerning last words from a patient, that this one was the creepiest. They started off by explaining that the man was obviously on his deathbed and that they knew he didn't have much time left, as he was experiencing renal failure. Apparently the patient has been pretty quiet for some time, but then all of a sudden his eyes got wide and he loudly yelled, "I see a bright light. Horses. No eyes. No, no, no." He then fell asleep for a bit, and Reddit user goes on to say that he woke up, looked up, and with his last breath he said, quote, "I understand." And he died right at that moment. The user finished off by explaining that, quote, "We know in the medical field that these situations are provoked by a cascade of neurotransmitters in disarray due to tissue and organ failure. But I sometimes have my doubts, and perhaps we are seeing more than we are led to believe." Coming in at number 6 is the Grim Reaper. Hallucinations can apparently be a normal occurrence for patients nearing death due to the high amount of pain meds they're on. But that doesn't mean that what they say still can't haunt you to your core, mostly cause you never really know what the truth is. One Reddit user named Koyena posted about a patient they had had one night that said, quote, "The devil has been in my room all night, but don't worry, God is with you. Then that night, after a horrible and brutal seizure, the man died with his eyes wide open and a creepy grimace plastered across his face. They explained that prior to the seizure, the man had been screaming at the devil in their room and kept shouting over and over, "Get out of here, the building's gonna blow." Now, thank God, nothing actually ever happened to the building, but still, the last thing this person ever said was that they were being haunted by the devil, and then they died with a haunting expression on their face. So, definitely unsettling. Coming in at number 5, DNR. Reddit user Callie Asari posted a few years back about one DNR patient they had had that really affected them for a long time after they died. So first off, DNR, if you don't know, stands for Do Not Resuscitate, which means that the patient has opted out of any and all life-saving treatments. Reddit friend starts off by saying, quote, "The patient was on a high dose of morphine and hallucinating. She would alternate between grasping for things not there and trying to climb out of bed. She was too unsteady to walk, so my job was to sit in the room and make sure she was safe. The patient apparently continued trying to get up, so the nurse simply asked, 'What do you need? I'd be happy to get it for you.' To which the woman grabbed her arm, pulled her in close, and said very angrily, quote, 'Kill me.' Safe to say the nurse was expecting her to ask for some water or something. Obviously the nurse did not kill her, but she did die soon after, and that was the last thing she said before she died. Pretty creepy, if you ask me. Coming in at number 4, a confession. Okay, so this one isn't from a nurse, it's actually from a surgeon, but it's really creepy, so I'm still counting it. There is a lot you might expect someone to confess on their deathbed. Cheating scandals, admitting that they hated something or someone, that they were a drug addict, or maybe there was a secret undercover agent. But this story posted to Reddit by the user Really Unbelievable a few years ago honestly sounds like the start of every plot of a true crime doc I've ever heard of. They say, quote, "Not sure if this is creepy, but a man on his deathbed kept repeating, 'The body is in the woods next to the oak tree,' over and over and over again until he passed." Yes, that is creepy, I would say. Was this man confessing to killing someone and hiding the evidence? Apparently police got involved and they ended up searching the area the patient had mentioned but never recovered any evidence of a body. True, it could have been nothing, but that doesn't really seem like something you'd say without any grounds to back it up. Coming in at number 3, hemorrhaging. This next story was by a now deleted Reddit account and might be one of the goriest stories I've ever heard. The patient was hooked up to a trach, which is a tube connected to your neck that helps you breathe when the patient is not able to do so themselves. A Reddit user says, quote, "I walked up to her and saw bright red blood just started shooting up the vent circuit and immediately obstructed it. This wasn't the first time they'd seen something like this, so they turned to the surgeon and explained that the patient was hemorrhaging, to which the doc apparently replied that it was just a little bit of blood, assuming the nurse was referring to the access site in her groin. The nurse knew that there was no time to waste, so they popped off the vent, but it was worse than they had even imagined. Blood started pouring out of her trach, mouth and nose at an exceeding rate until a pool about 6 feet in diameter circled them on the floor and they were covered from chest down. They said after a few minutes the patient used her last bit of strength to look into Reddit users' eyes and just say, quote, "Let me die." Coming in at number 2, fire. As I've mentioned, many nurses or medical staff chalk up strange late-stage behavior to pain meds or a way to cope. But this one story by L_3 had her questioning her own sanity for a few days after. Quote, "I had an old lady flag me down in the hallway a few days before she passed, and with her emaciated face and bulging eyes, she said, 'You know where I'm going.' The nurse asked her what she meant by that, to which she replied, 'You know where I'm going when I die, and it ain't up.'" I mean, while it was definitely obscure, our Reddit friend wasn't too freaked out by this point. She simply asked the patient if she would like to see the hospital priest on staff, to which the patient shook her head no and said, "It's too late for that." Then, a few days later, the patient was in bed, eating her dinner, and started screaming. And so the nurse ran in to find her shouting, "Fire, fire, fire! There's fire everywhere." The patient died a few hours later, and the nurse couldn't sleep that night as she was so freaked out that she'd actually witnessed someone seeing the literal fires of hell. And last up in our number 1 spot today, is saw the devil. Posted by Reddit user Lola CSD 6 years ago, they start off by explaining that their patient was a 20-year-old who had previously been a gang member, then ended up diagnosed with terminal liver cancer. The patient was very angry at the universe, which the nurse felt sympathy for, considering how young he was when he was dying, but mentioned that he was an incredibly aggressive and angry young man, often spitting in her or his family's faces and calling just about everyone who spoke to him cruel names. His anger only got worse as his condition progressed, but still his family remained by his side. On his last day, the family called in the nurse to the room as he wasn't responding. His eyes were glossed over, his skin cold, and was barely breathing. His mother, in a last attempt to comfort him, whispered to go towards the light, to Jesus, to which the young man came to and shouted, "F your Jesus." Then the nurse said the next part haunted her for weeks. He then slowly turned his head to the left and got the horrific look on his face, as if he was looking at something we couldn't see. And horrified, like in a bad movie, his face contorted and he screamed with his last breath, eyes wide, "Oh shit, oh shit, oh no!" Then made a guttural noise and promptly fell back into the bed and died. I mean, if that doesn't sound like someone seeing hell, then I don't know what does.
Coming in number 10, we have a visit from grandma. Reddit user @Namus talked about how when they were working as a doctor, his uncle became very ill. He was only 42 at the time, so there was a good chance that he would be able to push through and beat his sickness. He would go infrequently to see his uncle and get updates on how he was doing. There was one day when he came to visit and his uncle told him a story. He said that his mother, the Reddit user's grandmother, had come to visit him last night and told him that everything was going to be okay and she was going to come take him soon. The wild thing was that our Reddit user's grandmother had passed away quite some time ago. They sort of shrugged it off, thinking that he might have just had a dream about her, even though he explicitly said that it wasn't a dream. He said that she came to him and sat on his bed and they talked for quite a while. After he told the story, he passed away in less than 24 hours. That's pretty incredible and comforting. We have no idea what happens after we die. It's one of the great mysteries and we might never know. But hearing a story like this makes it seem like whatever's waiting for you on the other side might be nice and warm and loving. Coming at number 9, we have Yeah, That's It. Pork Chop 247 wrote in about a time when they worked in the intensive care unit. An older man came in and was actually suffering from a pretty serious infection of sepsis, and they needed to operate on him right away to try and save his life. They got him on the table quickly and they needed to act fast, but right before they put him under so they could operate, he said, "That's it," and he died. Pork Chop wrote about how that was kind of common with elderly people. When they would come in sick or hurt and needed help, whether they made it through or not, they had a very cavalier approach to death. They seemed as if they don't care if they made it through. I guess when you've been on the planet for so long, it won't faze you as much to come face to face with death. It's something you've been expecting for a long time, so when it's finally near, you might be thinking, it's about time. My joints have been aching for a decade now. Coming in at number 8, we have What Do You Think? Reddit user Giuseppino was working as a student in a hospital and was having one of his first run-ins with the emergency room. Someone was brought in who had been stabbed multiple times. Our Reddit user was obviously in shock because it was hard to know what to do in this situation, even though you have been trained for it. Nothing really compares to the real thing. So he asked the person if they were in any pain, and the patient responded, "What kind of dumb question is that? I have been stabbed." I took all of the swearing out because I had to clean it up for this channel, but of course this patient swore a bunch of times because they were in an insane amount of pain. It wasn't long after that that the patient died. Our Reddit user remembers this very clearly, and they will deal with situations like that in the emergency room different from now on. Coming in at number 7, we have Taking Blood. Reddit user Clyder wrote in about a time when they were working in a hospital and they had a younger patient come in who needed to have blood taken. It was supposed to be a normal procedure and there wasn't anything reported to be terribly wrong with the patient. They were just feeling a little bit sick. So they went to take the patient's blood, they brought the sample to the lab, and then they came back to see the patient. When they came back, the patient's whole arm was purple and they asked if they could have some water. The doctor said no because they needed to take the patient to the emergency right away. In that moment, they went into cardiac arrest and everyone rushed in to try and get the patient's heart started again. They eventually passed away. Our Reddit user left the room and cried and found their boss and quit on the spot. The thought of the patient asking for water right before they had a heart attack still sticks in her head. The reason that the patient passed away was because they had a bacterial meningitis infection. Coming in at number 6, we have The Great Nurse. Our next story comes from Reddit user Reader F52. They wrote about the time there was an older woman who was very ill in her hospital bed and her whole family was there. The woman was in her bed and started to look very panicked and her eyes were darting around the room. It seemed like she was about to have a panic panic attack. Then, right in that moment, a nurse who was in the room walked up to the woman and took her hand. She said, "It's okay. You're not alone. We're all here for you." Right as she said that, the woman in her bed laid back and calmly passed away. It was obviously a very sad moment for everyone in the room, but it was also beautiful to see a nurse who knew exactly what to say in probably the scariest moment of that woman's life. It was inspiring to the other nurses around her, and many of them wanted to be able to be that supportive to someone else in their moment of need. Coming in at number 5, we have spicy food. This next haunting story comes from Broken Nightlight on Reddit. They said that when they were a kid, they were in the hospital with their family because their granddad was very sick and bedridden. The doctor came into the room to check on his granddad, and right in that moment, his grandfather put his hand on his shoulder and said, "No wonder you never liked my spicy food," and then passed away. The doctor had no idea what this meant, his family had no idea what this meant, and of course our Reddit user was just as confused as to why his grandfather would say this as his last words. Well, it wouldn't make sense until 3 months later. He was eating some salsa and then his throat closed up and he had to be rushed to the hospital. After having a near-death experience, it was found that our Reddit user had a capsaicin allergy, which is mostly understood as an allergy to spicy food. How did his grandfather learn this in his final moments? Did he see an angel come down and let him know what was troubling his grandson? Or did this have nothing to do with anything and it was just a coincidence? I don't think we will ever know. Coming in number 4, we have Bill is Coming. This one kind of creeped me out. It was thrown on Reddit by Atomic Killbox, and it's a story from over 10 years ago. They were a new doctor working in a hospital and they had an older patient come in. It was a 96-year-old woman who was in the hospital even though she was very healthy. She actually was just coming in for a routine checkup. She was there with her son, and right as the doctor came in, the 96-year-old woman started talking about how Bill was going to come in and get her. Her son told the doctor that Bill was her husband who had died a few years ago. This was actually very strange because the woman wasn't senile. In fact, she was very sharp and had superb cognitive function for her age. Well, for whatever reason, she kept insisting that Bill was coming to get her. She even said that Bill came to see her that morning and told her he was going to take her home that night. The doctor did the checkup with the woman and then left the room. Then a code blue was called and everyone rushed into the old woman's room, but she had already passed away by the time the people arrived. One of the wildest parts about this was her son was actually very calm about the whole thing. It must have been a little bit comforting knowing that your mom was with the one she loved when she passed away. Coming in at number 3, we have It's Gonna Happen Tomorrow. It would seem that Reddit has no shortage of creepy stories coming from doctors. This one was from Reddit user IEscapeDNJ. They told a story about the time they were working in a hospital and there was an older woman who was very sick in her bed. She barely spoke because she was on so many meds. Then one day out of nowhere she turned to our Reddit user who was a doctor and she took off her oxygen mask and she said, "I'm going to die tomorrow." The woman put her mask back on and then went back to being silent. This shocked the doctor and she immediately went to contact all of her family. They all drove 4 hours to be there by her side, and sure enough, she died the next day with everyone by her side. Our Reddit user said that this is something that happened over 4 years ago, and this is something that still sticks in her head. Coming in number 2, we have The Killer. This one is going to stick in your head, but for a different reason. This was thrown on Reddit by Reddit user Baby Bop, and they said that they were working in palliative care and they heard a patient's wife talking to him as he was fading away. She didn't know that the doctor was listening to her, but the words that she had for her husband were both encouraging and terrifying. She said to him, "Jim, you beat that murder charge on that guy you killed. You can beat this." The man didn't end up beating his sickness, and the Reddit user doesn't say if any legal action was taken on these last words. And coming at the number 1 spot, we have The Last Words. This one is very sad but also kinda funny. A Reddit user talked about when their grandfather was sick in the hospital. Their whole family was there to see him, and because it looked like he was going to go, he had to get his affairs in order. He really didn't care about any of this because he just wanted to go. I mean, I get it. In your last moments of your life, do you want to be doing paperwork? Well, apparently our Reddit user's mom came in and said, "Dad, please just tell us where you want to be buried." And he said, "Don't care," and then flatlined right after. That's very sad, but also one hell of a punchline.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have James D. French. He was an American criminal, actually the last person to be executed under Oklahoma's death penalty. He was serving life in prison, but allegedly was too afraid to commit suicide, and so he murdered his own cellmate hoping to get the death penalty, which he did. When James French was strapped into the electric chair and asked for his last words, he supposedly asked those around him, "How's this for a headline? French fries." So yeah, his name, once again, was James French. Electric chair, French fries. Some people find that funny, some find it shocking, some people just don't know what to make of it. What do you guys think? Next up at number 9 now we have Oscar Wilde. This Irish poet and playwright was known for his biting wit and conversational skill. He seemed to have a quote for every occasion and remains one of the most quoted famous people in history. It seems only fitting then that his last words were some of his most famous. While lying in bed and dying of cerebral meningitis, Oscar said, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One or the other of us has to go." Coming in at number 8 now, we have time. I found this one on Reddit. It came from a Reddit user called Guy with Crazy Ideas who said, "Grandma's last words to the nurse on duty was, 'Time is not what you think it is.' She kept repeating it over and over and then died. They pulled me aside when I arrived and told me how strange and alert her eyes were as she kept repeating the statement about time. I still wonder about this to this day." That's pretty heavy. What do you guys think she meant? Some people feel that when people are close to death, they begin to see around the veil of reality, of the universe as we know it, that they feel more connected to what is beyond or the lack thereof.
All of a sudden, Grandma looked so terrified. She grabbed my hand and told me she didn't want to go. So I said, "Well, can you see God or heaven or a light or anything?"
What did she say?
"No, there's nothing."
Maybe the grandma felt something deep about time. Time is a very strange concept and something that science still doesn't fully understand. Moving on to number 7 now, we have horses. This one comes from Pat Laney on Reddit who said, "ER physician here, had heard many last words from patients, but the creepy one has to be of a man who was on his last breath as he succumbed to renal failure. He said, 'I see a bright light, horses, no eyes, no, no, no,' as he yelled loudly. At this point he was crashing when he suddenly woke up, looked up, and with his last breath he said, 'I understand,' and he died." We know in the medical field that these situations are provoked by a cascade of neurotransmitters in disarray due to tissue and organ failure, but I sometimes have my doubts and perhaps we are seeing more than we are led to believe. That is just one of the strangest things that I've ever heard. Hands down. What were the horses? What did he now understand? Why don't we understand that? I think I got a lot more questions than answers from this story. Coming in at number 6 now guys, we have Joseph Wright. You may not know his name, but you'll know his creation. Joseph Wright is credited with the editing of the English Dialect Dictionary. It's often regarded as his life work. There are 28 parts made up of 70,000 entries published over the course of 7 years. Another notable thing to mention about Joseph Wright is his famous last words, or should I say word, which was simply dictionary. That was it. According to reports, the man who contributed to one of the most famous dictionaries of all time died after just saying its name one last time. Sort of strange, but also kind of fitting in a way. Moving on now to number 5, we have the top hat. This one comes from a Reddit user who is a nurse. They said, "A nice old lady told my nursing assistant she wanted to wear all white. When asked why, she said, 'The man in black is here.' She looked in the corner of the room. The nursing assistant looked, but there was no one there. That's when I came into the room. We asked her to describe what she was seeing and she said, 'He's all in black and he's got a top hat on.' Then she whispered, 'And his eyes are red,' while her eyes moved across the room directly behind the nursing assistant like she was watching him move closer to us. She died later that night, but it was unexpected. That room creeped me out for a long time after that." Now, some people find it easy to dismiss that as just an old or sick person hallucinating, but others who hear the story are shocked by just how alert the woman seems in the story. She describes his clothes accurately, she watched his movements, and she knew that he had deep red eyes. Who was he? Well, I'm sure we all have a few guesses. Next up at number 4 now, we have Karl Marx. He was a famous German philosopher and political theorist that was the founder of Marxism as we know it. He had been suffering with bronchitis for the last year of his life. When things got really bad, his housekeeper asked him if he had any last words. Marx shouted at her, saying, "Go on, get out. Last words are for fools who haven't said enough." He died shortly after, making his angry quip about last words his own last words. Somewhat fitting. Next up at number 3 now, we have SpaghettiOs. Thomas J. Grasso was executed in 1995 for using Christmas tree lights to strangle an 85-year-old woman. His last meal request was for 24 steamed mussels, 24 steamed clams, a Burger King double cheeseburger, 6 barbecue ribs, 2 strawberry milkshakes, 1/2 of a pumpkin pie with whipped cream, diced strawberries, and a 16-ounce can of SpaghettiOs with meatballs served at room temperature. temperature. Well, it seems that he got everything, but his SpaghettiOs weren't right. Just before his execution, he was asked for any last words, to which he replied, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." Well, they did, and eventually the whole world did too. Moving on to number 2 now, guys, we have eyes. This one comes from a deleted Reddit account who simply said, "My grandfather on his deathbed said, 'They have no eyes.' It still gives me chills." That was posted in a thread asking doctors and nurses what the creepiest last words that they ever heard from patients was. That response had a lot of people saying it was the creepiest thing in the whole thread. Who are they? Is he seeing something or someone? What did he mean by "they have no eyes"? It could be something fairly normal and explainable, or it could be something more terrifying than we can even comprehend. Perhaps the scariest part is that we may never know. And finally, number 1 now, we have Richard B. Mellon. He was an American multimillionaire and president of the Aluminium Company of America. As a kid, he and his brother Andrew had always played tag. Now, as they grew up and lived in different places, they continued the game into adulthood and wanted to see how long they could make the other person remain it for. This would involve tagging the other brother before jumping on the train or driving off in a car. Things went on like this for 7 decades. When Richard was on his deathbed, he called over his brother and whispered his final words in his ear, simply saying "last tag" as he touched him. His brother Andrew then remained it until his own death 4 years later.
Kicking off the list at number 10, Sir Isaac Newton. Alright, yeah, we'll start this list off back in the early 1700s. Why not? Let's start crying back in the olden days. Sir Isaac Newton lived until he was 80, and back in the 1700s, living until you're 80, why, that's practically unheard of, right? That's insane. Newton started to experience digestion issues, but come 1727, he blacked out and never woke up again. The man died at 84. His last words were sad, of course, as are all of these on this very sad list that I'm doing, in a hopefully not sad way. But they go as follows. "I don't know what I may seem to the world, but as to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself now and then and finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." What exactly that means? Let's all talk about it in the comments. Let's try and decipher that. There we go. Number 9, John F. Kennedy. A little more recent, jumping to the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy was killed while riding in a motorcade. We all know this one, of course. I don't have to go into grim detail about what happened here. He was riding alongside his wife, of course, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, and in front of him there was Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie. They were all rolling along when Nellie said to John, "You certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a nice welcome." The president then said back, "No, I certainly can't." And just moments later, that's when he met his fate. Number 8, Alfred Hitchcock. This man went out with a zinger. Classic, what a classic drama queen. Alfred Hitchcock worked alongside famous painters and literary figures throughout history. He's an icon. He teamed up with Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Dorothy Parker, you name it. In his 1945 film Spellbound, Alfred even brought on Salvador Dali, like the real Salvador Dali, to help him with the film's dream sequences, right? He had a vision, he knew what he was doing. He also terrified many people for years to come. It's also a fun one. Hitchcock is known for going great lengths to keep his endings a secret, like Psycho, for example, a 1960s classic. The ad department for the film told audiences to please not give away the ending, as it's the only one they have. That's fun, that's cute. Weirdly mirrors his last words in real life. As he was dying, Alfred said, "One never knows the ending. One has to die to know exactly what happens after death, although Catholics have their hopes." That sounds very Alfred Hitchcocky. Number 7, Steve Jobs. A little more modern, there we go. When I was making this list, I couldn't believe how long it's been since Steve Jobs has passed away. It's been a while. The tech icon's last moments were in 2011. He was surrounded with love. He had beside him his sister Patty, his children, and his partner Laureen. Steve looked above them and said, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." He said "oh wow" 3 times. That's pretty heavy stuff to hear. Steve's last moments were shared furthermore when his sister wrote in his eulogy, "Even now he had a stern, still handsome profile, the profile of an absolutist, a romantic." Number 6, Nostradamus. I predict that you'll hit that thumbs up. That's inappropriate, but we try our best. The astrologer's last words were in itself predictions. and this last prediction he sadly got right. Nostradamus, full name Michel de Nostradam, published a book on prophecies back in 1555, and in it he had 942 pieces of writing. He had these poems that told the future, right? These texts have supposedly hinted towards the JFK attack, meteors hitting Earth, the invasion of France, global warming, you name it. He said some eerie things about such topics, and he also predicted his own death. On paper, he did. It was his last ever prediction. It was July 1st, 1566. His priest said to him, "Until tomorrow," and Nostradamus replied, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." Sadly, he was correct. Number 5, Beethoven. Another icon, another staple in history, the German composer Ludwig van Beethoven. We've recently heard his work in theaters. In Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Doctor Strange fights the villain with musical notes. He uses these notes. He uses Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor. Now we've heard Beethoven in IMAX, right? What a time to be alive. When Ludwig was still alive, he faced many health problems. Hepatitis, jaundice, skin diseases, cirrhosis of the liver, and of course, deafness. When his time came on March 26, 1827, the composer was believed to have said, "Applaud, my friends, the comedy is over." This is false. This is not true at all. Beethoven's close friend, Anselm Hüttenbrenner, who was very much present during his friend's passing, he said his last words were about the case of red wine that had just been delivered from his publisher. Ludwig's true last words followed, and they were, "Pity, pity, too late." About the wine. Fair. More than fair. It was a little too late. Number 4, Marie Antoinette. Another older one, but I figured I'd go more Victorian for this list, you know? Instead of like recent celebrities, that's only depressing. We don't want to talk about those. During the height of the French Revolution, Louis XVI of France and Marie Antoinette were both charged with treason. The phrase, "let them eat cake," is often associated with Mrs. Antoinette in this case, but her last words were actually an apology. Not to the people in which they owed it to, but to the executioner whose foot she stepped on whilst approaching the guillotine. Yeah, shows like Game of Thrones make it look easy to say something cool right before your, demise. In reality, I would beg for my life. Looking up at this dude? Yeah, I would plea. I'd be like, please don't do this. I really don't want this to happen. Number 3, Bob Marley. Of course, we have to mention the one and only reggae legend, Bob Marley, okay? Cancer was the reason that this icon met his fate early. The big C, once again. Marley was only 36 years old when he passed away in 1981. Next to him, he had his son Ziggy, and to him he shared the final words. And I think we could all learn a little something here. He said to Ziggy, "Money can't buy life." Yeah, I'll say that again. Money can't buy life. Not happiness, life. Bob Marley's death was so impactful that the Jamaican government turned this sad day into a national holiday. Yeah, that's a great idea. Live some more of that life. Take the day off. Blast some Marley and, you know the rest. Stuff I can't talk about, light some candles, right? That's an ideal way to mourn somebody as impactful as Bob Marley. I'm here for it. Number 2, Giles Corey. Out of the 27 people who had their lives taken away from them during the 1692 Salem witch trials, 19 were hanged, 17 passed away in prison while serving their sentence, and the last victim, Giles Corey, refused to plead either innocent or guilty. And the law at the time states that you can't be tried otherwise, so he did what was ultimately best for him and his family and his estate. The townsfolk laid a heavy board on top of the 81-year-old man during the witch trials and all that nonsense, and then over the course of 2 days, boulders were slowly added, making the weight more and more unbearable. They were hoping that Giles would admit something, either being innocent or guilty, whatever the case, but every time they asked him anything, Giles responded with, "More weight." How epic is that? Extremely brave. This is something like, it sounds easy, but in reality, I would never do this. I would fold immediately. I would be like, this is so hard. But sadly, after 2 days of this torture, Giles passed away. He fought for so long and did what he could because if he had gone either of the other two ways, Giles would have his property taken away from the town. But since he passed away not admitting guilt, he was still in full possession of his estate, which immediately went to his son-in-law. And finally, number 1, Robin Williams. Okay, I wanted to end on one that really hit home for me personally. I try and bring comedy into these lists whenever I can. It's like, cursed dolls that will haunt your family. I'm like, okay, I try and jazz it up a bit. I try and add some physicality to it whenever I can, brighten the mood. Because I was raised watching this man right here. Robin sadly passed away in August 2014. I was 19 at the time. I still remember the day, right? It was the first celebrity death that actually did something to me physically. And I don't mean for that to sound sensitive, but I grew up with this man, right? He was Like Hook, Aladdin, robots, so underrated, right? Robin's wife Susan Schneider Williams revealed her husband's last words in an interview with ABC, and when the couple was getting ready for bed the night before, his last words were, "Good night, good night." Yeah, I wanted to end on a nice, good, peaceful note instead of something horrible from the 1700s. There we go.
In at number 10 with Gary Gilmore. During a robbery, Gilmore shot a man twice in the head, even though he was cooperating with his demand. The next day, he attempted to rob a motel, and he ended up fatally shooting the manager in the head. He confessed to the police that he killed 2 people in cold blood, but he was only tried for one of the murders because there wasn't enough physical evidence against him for the other murder. I mean, what the heck? If someone admits to a crime, isn't that enough? Well, the judge sentenced him to a death penalty, and he had a choice of being executed by hanging or shot by a firing squad. I guess he's a fan of irony because he chose to get killed by a firing squad. And his infamous last words were, "Let's do it." Those definitely wouldn't be my final words. I'd probably be screaming. I think Nike must have been inspired by his final last words. Let's do it. Climbing up this list, and at number 9, we're talking about Erskine Childers. Now, I know what you guys must be thinking. Everyone on this list must have committed a horrible crime in order to get the death penalty. Well, he might be our one exception to this rule. Childers was actually an Irish author who wrote a lot of successful novels, but he also had a little bit of a dark side. He would smuggle guns into Ireland with his sailing yacht until he was caught and sentenced to death. I mean, this seems pretty harsh, but this was during the late 1800s. But what makes things even worse, he filed an appeal and it was pending when they executed him, which is highly illegal today. So before he was executed by a firing squad, he said, "Take a step forward, lads. It will be easier that way." I don't blame him for being bitter. I think this was a pretty cruel and unusual punishment for his crime. Number 8, we have Jimmy Glass, who said, "I'd rather be fishing." Yeah, no shit. I think I'd rather be in a cave of sleeping grizzly bears or at a One Direction concert than be on the chopping block about to die. It's like Jimmy doesn't really give a shit that he's about to die. I think he must have come to terms with his death because those definitely aren't inspiring or moving last words. I wonder what he picked to be engraved on his tombstone. "I'd rather be alive." But before you start feeling sorry for him, just know that he was a convicted murderer, so he had it coming. John Avalos Alba brings us to number 7. He was handed down the death penalty for fatally shooting his wife while he was out on bail for a child molestation charge. He was finally executed by lethal injection on May 25th, 2010. I bet the judge who set his bail was feeling really guilty for not setting it higher. So for his final statement on Earth, he said this airy line: "Okay, Warden, let's do it. I love ya. I can taste it already. I'm starting to go." I mean, that just gives me chills. I read that you can feel the cold rush of the lethal injection piercing through your veins. Probably the worst feeling ever. And of course, it's the last feeling ever. I don't know whether or not that's true, but I guess I don't care to know. And now, in at our number 6 spot, we have a really odd last words. James French was a convicted murderer, and he was actually the last person to be executed under Oklahoma's death penalty. He was a pretty violent man. He was already convicted to life in prison for murdering a man who had picked him up from hitchhiking, but he had the desire to die, so that's when he brutally murdered his cellmate in order to get the death penalty. As soon as he was prepped to be executed by the electric chair, he came up with these infamous last words. How's this for a headline? French fries. Do you guys get it? His last name was French, and he was about to get fried by the electric chair. I know I shouldn't be laughing, but it's a little clever. From one scary but clever final statement to another, and at number 5 is George Apple. He said, "Well, gentlemen, you are about to see a baked apple." I would like to think I was given the opportunity for a final statement. I would say something clever like this, but it's also pretty morbid if you think about it, so actually maybe I would use the opportunity to say something wise. Well, thankfully I don't really have to think about it because I don't intend to ever be on death row. But anyways, George Apple was originally sentenced to death for committing an evil murder, so I guess he had it coming. Now number 4 brings us to John Rook. In 1980, he kidnapped a 25-year-old nurse in a parking lot where she worked. She was taken to an empty field where she was abused and murdered by Rook. After the killing, he ran her body over with his car. I mean, wow, was that even necessary? After he was sentenced to death, he made several appeals, but they all failed. So on the day of his execution, he said, "Freedom! Freedom at last!" It's been a good one. Well, I hope you enjoy your freedom, and I'm glad you won't be able to hurt anyone ever again. Tory Twain McNabb takes us to number 3 on our list. He was executed by lethal injection for killing a police officer back in 1997. His lawyers attempted to make an appeal stating that the state's execution methods was cruel and unusual, but the judge was pretty firm and declined their appeals. So during his final minutes, he said, "Mom, sis, look at my eyes. I got no tears. I am unafraid. To the state of Alabama, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you." And as the procedure began, he raised his middle finger to the police officers, and he actually died in that position. I mean, wow, what an honorable way to go. Not. And now at number 2 is Carlos Granados. During a heated argument with his girlfriend, he grabbed a large kitchen knife and stabbed her 3-year-old son. I mean, whoa, talk about anger management issues. And he also stabbed his girlfriend 30 times, but she survived and was able to testify against him in court. For his final meal, he requested fried chicken, pizza, and a soft drink. And right before he was given the lethal injection, he said, "Kathy, you know I never meant to hurt you. I gave you everything. And that's what made me so angry. But I never meant to hurt you. I'm sorry." Well, I think it's a little bit too late for an apology. I hope she didn't even show up to his execution. Topping off this morbid list, and at number 1, we have Peter Manuel. He is actually known as Scotland's worst serial killer ever. He was convicted of murdering a total of 7 people between the years of 1956 and 1958, but it is believed that he killed many more people. He was hanged at Glasgow's Barlinnie prison, and he was one of the last people to have ever been executed in these gallows ever since the death penalty was overturned. But before he stepped out to his death, he said, "Turn up the radio and I'll go quietly." There's just something about that statement that gives me the chills.
Alright, at number 10 we have a mass hallucination. This one was posted by a nurse that goes by RN_waitress on Reddit. During a 2012 outbreak of fungal meningitis, the acute care floor she was working on had at least 10 to 15 meningitis patients. The floor itself has a capacity of 20. Many of these meningitis patients were having the same hallucinations. The nurse wrote on Reddit that they experienced children in the corners of their rooms and auditory hallucinations of religious music. Now, if you think this was a prank being played by sick patients, then think again. All of the patients were in isolation with no shared rooms and no communication between one another. So what do you think caused it? Specific parts of the brain the fungal infection was affecting, or was it something else?
Coming in at number 9 is the bloodbath. Now this one is gruesome and shared by a user called Paravel. So they shared that they were working their regular night shift in a bone marrow transplant unit with another nurse. They had 5 patients, and as the other nurse was coming out of room 4, she shared that the patient in there had died a very gruesome death. He was slated and approved to go home, but that same night, the nurses heard the sound of someone falling. They went in to check on him and saw nothing but blood. The man had pulled out his own central line, and there was blood everywhere, like it was a bloodbath, Game of Thrones Red Wedding style. He died right there and then, and no one knew why he did it. He was literally free to go. But get this, a few weeks later, a little old lady gets moved into that same room, and she asks if anyone had died in there. The nurse brushed it off, saying people die in the hospital all the time, but the old lady replied by saying, no, I think a young guy died in here because he's talking to me right now. Now this woman also has a central line, and later that night, the nurse goes in to check on her. Again, an utter bloodbath. Her central line had been cut. Not pulled like the other guy, it was proper cut. There was no scissors in the room, and all the lady said was, "He did it." Right, enough of that.
Next at number 8, we have false hope. This one comes from an ER nurse who spoke from a now deleted account on Reddit. She had an old lady stay in the ER overnight that was near death. They saw the signs: irregular breath, barely responsive, pale and cool, so they turned the lights down and kept an eye on her monitor. They searched and couldn't find any family, and then on top of that, she was a DNR, do not resuscitate. So the writer says they were basically waiting for her to die. She was close. And then, an hour later, all of a sudden, she's standing at the door of her room with all of her clothes back on, just there. Apparently, she was hungry, so they got her food, and while she ate, the old woman talked to the staff a little bit in her room, but then she told her nurse she was tired and wanted to lie back down. Within 30 minutes, she was dead. This surge of energy is called rallying before death, and it's not uncommon, but it's super unnerving, just like this Redditor said, and it's just unnerving to see so much life in a person before death. Scary.
Now at number 7 is Speak Back to Me. Now this story comes from a travel nurse called Courtney, and if you don't know what a travel nurse is, it's basically a nurse that travels across the country and works at a new hospital every 13 weeks. Now Courtney shared that she was working at an ICU at the time, and she had a patient there that would only repeat what was said to her and say nothing else. Now that day Courtney was with her all night, and she started telling her all the ways she had apparently died, saying things like, I died because I took too much insulin, I died because of narcotic overdose, I died on a sunny Sunday afternoon, and so on. Now Courtney kind of brushed it all off as the patient was troubled, but then she looked up at the ceiling and said, they're all still here. At that point Courtney was like, I'm gonna up the hell out of here, and ran out of the room. If that was me, I'd be like, medicate honey, I'm not here to be hearing you talk about the ghosts of deaths past, I'm here to do my job and then leave. She further shared that once she was caring for a blind patient who continuously asked her what time it was all night. She left and came back a while later to check in on her, and all the patient said was, it's the witching hour. Court looked at the time, saw it was 3:33 AM and walked out, and hopefully never returned, because I sure damn would have not.
Alright, on to number 6, A Shriek and a Goat Man. Now, this isn't the shrieking goat like that Taylor Swift cover. This is a story that comes from the mother of Danger Moose, or Danger M-U-U-S, on Reddit. She was on night shift, the mother, in a hospital in Arizona going room to room when an old lady told her about a goat man trying to get through the doors. This woman was an insomniac, so the mother didn't think anything of it. Then, a blood-curdling shriek rang out that people heard all around the hospital. People were freaked out, and then a few looked out the windows where they found hoof marks by the doors and windows, with no trails leading to or from them. That insomniac clearly knew something was up, and it must have been the goat man causing that shriek, right? Either himself or through nefarious means?
Filling our number 5 slot is the hallucination. Now this one's from Reddit user Whites42, who worked as an ICU nurse. She shared that a woman in her 20s had come in with serious cardiac abnormalities and then abruptly went into respiratory distress. She was put on a ventilator and was sedated just enough to keep her lucid. She could nod to answer questions, and that's all they really needed from her at the time. Now a few nights later, the patient in the room next to her has died, but the body was yet to be taken to the morgue. Now the girl's room door was closed and the male patient's curtain was drawn, so they never met, nor did they see each other. The nurse went to check in on the woman, and she looked like she was about to die, like she was in pure panic mode, and the nurse asked her if she was cold, were you in pain, are you warm, and she said no to everything. She then asked if she saw something, and she started nodding aggressively. And mind you, just because she was sedated, that doesn't mean she was hallucinating, like she wasn't. She started probing and asking questions to try and figure out what she was seeing, and she found out that the patient was seeing a Caucasian bald man missing his left arm. The nurse then freaked out when she realized the patient was seeing the ghost of the man who had died in the room next to her without ever actually seeing him. Okay.
At number 4, Followed by Death. This comes from another deleted account on Reddit. A staff member at a skilled nursing facility was typically working in the Alzheimer's ward and had a troubling string of experiences. First, they heard someone shuffle behind them, and then they feel someone put a hand on their shoulder while they're in a linen closet. So when they turn around, they see no one there and the door is still closed, so it was a bit freaky. Then another lady began to complain to them for 2 weeks straight every night that a man was coming into her room at night. That being in the Alzheimer's ward, the author of this post didn't take it too seriously, saying they'd check in on her throughout the night. At the end of the 2 weeks of complaining, the staff member asked what the man looked like, just out of curiosity. The woman said, "He's real handsome and wears a black suit. Oh, he's right behind you now, honey," which justifiably freaked the writer of this story out. There was no one behind them, and as for the old lady, she died the next night in her sleep. So was the person in the suit death following them? Is that what they felt with their hand on the shoulder on the hand? I leave it to you.
At number 3 is the Grim Reaper. Now this one's from Redditor Scary Kerry 91476, and boy, oh boy, are you guys not ready for this one. So Kerry is an intensive care nurse, and she shared that back in 1999, she was in a 12-bedded ITU in London. She was in charge of the nurses station, and she looked up to see a man coming through the double doors of the unit. And that image just stuck in her mind even 20 years later. It was like he had been plucked out of 1974 and dropped into 1999. He was wearing cord pants, a check shirt with a patterned tank top on top, and platform shoes. He looked about 30 years old, and he just very calmly walked towards the bay of patients. Now Kerry had no idea who he was, so she asked him, and he responded by nodding and then just continued walking. Alright then. He went and stopped at the end of a patient's bed and just looked at them. He didn't touch them, there was no contact, he just made eye contact. The patient was sick but very stable, but as the man was looking at them, they suddenly started deteriorating in front of Kerry's eyes. Staff rushed over to assist him and they were just acting like the man wasn't even there. And with that being said, he exited as calmly as he had come in. The patient ended up dying and Kerry asked the assisting staff who the man was, and none of them had even seen him or remembered any man even walking in that day. So Kerry thoroughly believed that she saw the Grim Reaper at work that day. And Kerry, I bloody agree with you.
At number 2, we have a C-section nightmare. It comes from P as in Peter on Reddit, who had a traumatizing experience while getting a C-section. She said that when the doctors were preparing to close her, she had blood splash on her face. Her own blood. She wrote that one of the doctors working on her must have dropped one of her organs. Like, hello? This woman was simultaneously giving life and being reminded that hers is fragile. She at least had a good attitude about it because she said her family got their money's worth from the anesthesiologist who wiped the blood from her face and glasses. But that's an organ falling and splash. I don't know how they are not super traumatized by this, but that's the miracle of life, ladies and gentlemen.
And last but not least, at our number 1 spot is the repetition. Now this one's from Redditor Cam Brewer, who was a 4th year nursing student when this happened to them. She was sitting for a 28-year-old woman who was going through alcohol withdrawal, and it was the 3rd day, which is scientifically the worst. And sitting is basically when you sit by a patient that could be dangerous to themselves or others, and this woman was fully restrained, like hands and feet were bound to the bed. She was shouting racial slurs at the nurse and spitting on her, and after a while started straight up hallucinating. She thought she was in her car driving with her 2 kids in the back, and she kept begging the nurse to take the wheel. She then explained the car crash in vivid detail, saying that her son had died. She kept crying and apologizing and repeatedly kept asking the nurse to hand her the body of her dead son. She was sedated, and when that wore off, the same hallucinations happened again. The same scenario happened 8 times in this woman's 12-hour shift, and after hearing it enough times, she realized it wasn't a hallucination at all. This was something that she had actually done but was replaying in her mind in her delirious state. Can you imagine being so delirious that like you're hallucinating a car crash where you killed your 7-year-old son, but it's not hallucination, it's real? Nope.
Starting off this countdown, we have Alison Firth. So like I mentioned previously, this case of Alison Firth is mentioned in Magellan TV's documentary Nurses Who Kill. Alison Firth was responsible for looking after an 84-year-old woman with dementia, Alice Grant. But Firth hated her job. Half the time she would show up late and leave early, or come to work dirty and do a sloppy job looking after Miss Grant. She also told her colleagues on a number of occasions that she wanted Grant to just hurry up and die already. When that wasn't happening, she decided to take measures into her own hands. She ended up administering her a powerful unprescribed sedative and then left her there to die. Now if you want to learn more about this case, because it gets even more messed up and twisted, then I suggest you watch it on Magellan TV. Trust me, you will not be disappointed. In our 9th spot today, we have Niels Hogel. Niels Hogel was a German nurse who between 1999 to 2005 took the lives of more than 90 patients. He did so by injecting them with a cardiovascular drug. This would create a medical emergency, and then he would swoop in to save the day. He then would resuscitate them at the last minute, and people would be like, oh, what a hero. Some, however, he just left to die. But people soon grew suspicious. The hospital realized that since Niels was hired, the amount of patients passing away dramatically increased, specifically on his shifts. Then in 2005, colleagues at the hospital caught him injecting a patient with drugs, so they called the police. In the end, he was given a 7.5-year prison sentence, and he's never allowed to practice in the medical field ever again. In our 8th spot, we have Petra Zelenka. In 2006, Czech nurse Petra Zelenka was arrested after it was found out he took the lives of at least 17 of his patients. He did so by injecting them with a blood thinner. A large enough dose would cause the patients to die from internal bleeding. Well, this was like a game to him. He said it was all a test to see how aware and proficient the doctors were and if they would catch him on time. Now, he's currently serving a life sentence. Moving on at number 7, we have Amy Archer. Back in the early 1900s, Amy was the owner of Sister Amy's nursing home for the elderly in Connecticut. But she never had the right intentions when she opened it. Between 1911 to 1916, 48 residents passed away, all of which willed her large sums of money before they passed.
Obviously, this was hella suspicious, so it started an investigation. The bodies were then autopsied and most had died from arsenic poisoning, including her husband. In the end though, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Coming in at number 6 we have Daniela Poggiali. Daniela Poggiali is an Italian nurse who started to take the lives of her patients because they were bothering her. So she would inject her patients with potassium chloride, which is used as a lethal injection for some individuals on death row. After doing so, she would steal money and jewelry from them, and then she would take a selfie with their dead bodies. That is so wrong. It said that she was responsible for 96 deaths during her time as a nurse. In 2014, she was caught and charged with her crimes. She was sentenced to life behind bars. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Orville Lynn Majors. In the early 1990s, a hospital in Indiana saw an increase in patients' deaths. These were elderly patients in the ICU. Typically, they would see 20 to 30 deaths per year, but then all of a sudden it increased to more than 100, so they were completely shocked. Little did they know that one of their nurses was behind all of this. Orville Lynn Majors injected around 130 patients with heart-stopping drugs. He typically would target the elderly who were whiny or demanding. But according to his roommate, he believed that the elderly, and I quote, should all be gassed. Eventually, the hospital started to notice a pattern and began an investigation. At one point, there was a week where the deaths just suddenly plummeted. And that's cause this dude was on a vacation that week. In 1997, Majors was arrested for his crimes. This was after police did a number of autopsies and found lethal drugs in the patient's systems. In 1999, Majors was sentenced to 360 years in prison. In our 4th spot, we have Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Woods, otherwise known as the Lethal Lovers. These two individuals were co-workers in a romantic relationship that got off to killing patients together. Their first victim was an elderly patient with Alzheimer's who Gwendolyn suffocated. After that, they went on to take the lives of at least 5 more patients together in a 2-month period in 1987. Apparently, they thought doing this would keep them together, and so they formed what they called a murder pact, which didn't end up working for them because they ended up breaking up, and then Kathy admitted to the killings and dragged Gwendolyn down with her. Moving on at number 3, we have Sonia Calefi. Italian nurse Sonia Calefi slowly started to become more and more unstable. She suffered from bad self-esteem issues and felt undervalued at work. So she decided to take her frustration out on her patients. She would do this through oxygen injections in their veins, which would cause death by embolism and respiratory failure. When she was caught, she confessed to the murders of 5 patients, although her diary revealed that she had taken the lives of around 22 patients. In her confession, she said, and I quote, "I just wanted to attract attention because I felt undervalued. And then those people who had a short time to live made me feel pity. That's why I picked up the pace of their death." And much like the other nurses on today's list, sometimes she would make the patients ill before heroically saving them so that people would just praise her. Moving on at number 2, we have Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey is unlike any of the nurses on today's list, and that's because he started killing at the young age of 18. Back then, he began working in a hospital as a hospital attendant. During that time, he admitted to taking at least a dozen lives. 2 he suffocated, the other 10 he hooked them up to near-empty oxygen tanks. Over the years, his number of victims began to rise. He then started to kill the patients by injecting them with arsenic or cyanide, which is when he got caught. After a cyanide poisoning, police knew that the victim was killed by someone in his care, and all signs pointed to Harvey. Under questioning, Harvey admitted to killing 87 victims, but only 36 were confirmed. His reason? Sometimes he was angry at the victim. Other times he thought he was doing them a favor by ending their suffering. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Kristen Gilbert. From 1995 to 1996, Kristen worked at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton. So many patients actually passed on her watch that her coworkers were joking around calling her the Angel of Death. But they were right. Gilbert was injecting the veterans with epinephrine, which would cause them to have heart attacks. The hospital started to become suspicious when their epinephrine supply became mysteriously low and the amount of people suffering heart attacks became mysteriously high. They knew something was up, so some nurses alerted the authorities and the police came in to investigate. Now here's where Kristen made her biggest mistake. She decided to call in a bomb threat to derail the investigation, but this just led the police right to her. They found out that she was the one who called in the threat and started to investigate her. In the end, it was said that she was responsible for 80 or more deaths at the hospital and over 300 medical emergencies. The reason for all of this? Well, some say she was trying to demonstrate her nursing abilities by creating emergency situations and then saving the patients. Whereas others claim she was starting these emergencies to get the attention of James Perot, a police officer at the hospital who she later had an affair with. In 2001, she was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 20 years.